Betwixt and Between Patterns of Masculine and Feminine Initiation. Edited by Louise Motti, Stephen Foster, and Meredith Little. Symbols of Initiation and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Harold Schechter. In his essay, Symbols of Initiation and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Harold Schechter finds striking similarities between traditional rites of passage and the many adventures of Huck Finn. Not only does this chapter offer evidence of Mark Twain's sense of patterns of initiation, but Schechter identifies basic aspects of an American male initiatory journey with numerous amplifications from other cultures. After Huck's passage down the Mississippi in the company of Shaman Jim and various other initiators, Schechter concludes, "The young hero seems to have found true masculine maturity despite Twain's attempt to have him yet remain a child." Schechter demonstrates how Huckleberry Finn can be read as a story of male initiation. Most Americans have some knowledge of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and this chapter adds a new dimension to our understanding of its meaning and fascination. Harold Schechter, Ph.D., is Associate Professor of English at Queens College, City University of New York. He has written extensively on the relationship between archetypal myth and the popular arts. He is author of numerous articles and several books, including The New Gods, Psyche and Symbol in Popular Art, and Patterns in Popular Culture. His current project is a book-length study of folklore and film. It is interesting and a little curious that while many critics see Huckleberry Finn as the story of an initiation of a boy's growth to manhood and his final acceptance of adult moral responsibilities, no one has ever examined the book in relation to any actual initiation ceremonies. And yet, when we compare Twain's novel to those rituals whose function is to transform the adolescent male into an adult, we discover a number of astonishing parallels. In his remarks on the sad initiation of Huckleberry Finn, James M. Cox contends that the whole initiation and rebirth theme is launched on a tragicomic note, in a chapter significantly entitled "Pap Starts In on a New Life." To be sure, Pap's avowal that he is beginning a new life and I'll die before I'll go back is the first of several humorous references to death and rebirth in the novel. But in order to trace the initiatory pattern that underlies Huckleberry Finn, we must turn back to the very beginning, before Pap even appears, for Huck's situation in the opening chapters is very close to that of the uninitiated males of certain primitive communities. Extreme sexual segregation is characteristic of many tribes. Men are, to a very large extent, isolated from the world of the women. Only the male children who have not yet been initiated, have yet to pass through their puberty rites, are in constant interaction with the women of the tribe. In their studies of primitive secret societies, both Robert H. Lowy and Hutton Webster discuss the men's house, that ubiquitous institution within whose precincts women and children and men not fully initiated members of the tribe never enter. Note that in many societies, young boys and females eat, live, and sleep apart from the initiated males. This is certainly true of the Arunta of Australia, whose puberty ceremonies are more extensively documented than those of any other Australian tribe. Spencer and Gillen report that up until the time of their initiation, Arunta boys live away from the men's camp, or Ngunja, and reside with the women and girls. Thus, as Giza Rohim explains, the Arunta youth is raised in a state of communal motherhood. Discussing the psychological development of these Central Australian boys, Rohim writes that they grow up the way all children grow up, through playing at being grown up. The children played at performing ceremonies like the men. At the beginning of Twain's novel, Huck too resides in a world dominated by women. Aunt Polly, the widow Douglas, Miss Watson. Within this maternal and female world, Huck lives with other boys his age, 13 or 14 or along there. Boys who are ripe for and play at initiation. For it is not, as Cox maintains, Chapter 5 which launches the theme of initiation in the novel, but Chapter 2, Argane's Dark Oath, in the blood ritual which Huck and his friends must perform in order to join Tom's outlaw band. We have a comic foreshadowing of the initiatory ordeals which Huck will later undergo, and the oath of secrecy which the gang members swear is a burlesque version of the vow of silence that is a central feature of many actual initiation ceremonies, as Huck explains. If anybody that belonged to the band told the secrets, he must have his throat cut and then have his carcass burnt up and the ashes scattered all around and his name blotted off the list with blood and never mentioned again by the gang, but have a curse put on it and be forgot forever. Some thought it would be good to kill the families of boys that told the secrets. Tom said it was a good idea, so he took a pencil and wrote it in. During the puberty rites of the Arunta, Spencer and Gillen report, the novice is told that on no account must he ever tell any woman or boy of what he was about to see. Should he reveal any of the secrets, then he and his nearest relatives would surely die. It is worth noting that in his True Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, John Seeley retitles the second chapter, Initiation Night and the Morning After. Clearly, Seeley also recognizes that it is this and not the later chapter that announces the theme of initiation in Twain's novel. Puberty institutions for the initiation of young men into manhood, writes Hutton Webster, are among the most widespread and characteristic features of primitive life. Though varying endlessly in detail, their leading characteristics reproduce themselves with substantial uniformity among many different peoples and in widely separated areas of the world. Jungian psychologists, of course, account for this uniformity by explaining that initiation rites are based with small variations on the same archetypal ground pattern. The first step in the transformation of the male adolescent into an adult, and this is universal, is to separate him from his previous environment, the world of women and children, to sever his childhood domestic ties. The way in which this is accomplished is often by a violent action, i.e., the abduction of the novice. Discussing Australian initiation ceremonies, Mircea Eliade notes that the scenario is the same everywhere among the Aborigines. The novices are seized by their guardians and carried off to the forest. The elders who perform this ritual kidnapping, moreover, are terrifying figures, for they are usually colored white, smeared with white clay or ashes, or covered with bird down. While the novices regard them as boogeymen, they are actually meant to represent the ancestors, mythical, primal, titanic men who walked the earth in former times, temporarily resurrected in order to participate in the ceremonies. What we have here, writes Eliade, is a periodic return of the dead among the living for the purpose of initiating the youth. Speaking of these white clay men, Henderson explains that although impersonating death in its ghostly aspect, they are also harbingers of that new life which springs anew from the original source of all things. It is significant that those men are represented as being white. This white is an ambiguous color and would seem to embody just that spirit of paradox, which is the essence of the death and rebirth experience. What we find at the beginning of the puberty rites, then, is the boy being torn from the maternal sphere, from the control of the women, and spirited off to the forest by a resurrected deathly white boogeyman. This, of course, is precisely what happens to Huck. Pat, supposedly drowned, appears one night in Huck's room at the widow's. He's a frightening figure. There weren't no color in his face. Where his face showed, it was white. Not like another man's white, but a white to make a body sick, white to make a body's flesh crawl, a tree-toad white, a fish belly white. Then, one day in the spring, the traditional time for the performance of many rebirth ceremonies, he lays for Huck, seizes him, and rows him across the river to the Illinois shore, where it was woody and there weren't no houses but an old log, but in a place where the timber was so thick you couldn't find it if you didn't know where it was. At first, Huck enjoys himself, but by and by, Pop got too handy with his hickory and couldn't stand it. I was all over welts. He got to going away so much too and locking me in. Once he locked me in and was gone 3 days. It was dreadful lonesome. I judged he had got drowned and I wasn't ever going to get out anymore. I was scared. Things get even scarier though when Pop returns, drinking himself blind after dinner. He has a violent attack of DTs and, looking wild, begins chasing Huck round and round the place with a clasped knife, calling me the angel of death and saying he would kill me and then I couldn't come for him no more. I begged and told him I was only Huck, but he laughed such a screechy laugh and roared and cussed and kept on chasing me up. Finally, though, Pat tires himself out in telling Huck that he will rest a minute and then kill him, falls asleep. Huck crouches down behind a turnip barrel to keep watch over Pap with a gun, and how slow and still the time did drag along. Now, a feature that is common to nearly all primitive puberty initiations is the period of containment, which the novice must undergo, often in a secluded hut far away in the forest. Within this hut, the boy is subjected to a variety of ordeals, symbolic of the initiatory death that is the prerequisite for rebirth. Describing the puberty ceremonies of certain Malaysian tribes, Arnold van Gennep notes that the novice is taken to a sacred place. There he is beaten with more or less heavy sticks by the tubulan, a sort of divine boogeyman. Webster, speaking of puberty rites in general, refers to the brutal beatings received by the novices. Iliade describes the initiation rites of the Yamana tribe of Terra del Fuego. The boys are segregated in a cabin, and an evil spirit, the earth spirit Yatita, plays an important role. During the ceremony, Yatita is represented by one of the instructors, painted white. Springing from behind the curtain, he attacks the novices. Another ordeal which these novices undergo, documented more or less all over the world, is the ordeal of sleeplessness. The Yamana youth is required to keep long vigils. The most prevalent of all initiatory ordeals, however, and the most terrifying, is circumcision. Iliade observes that the circumcision of the novice typically symbolizes his ritual murder by a demonic being. Among certain tribes, in fact, circumcision is expressed by the verb to kill. In Australia and elsewhere, the operation is usually performed by an elder who wields a small flint knife and whose attitude is that of a furious father attacking his son's penis. Paul Radin describes the circumciser. Finally, the operator appears, his eyes rolling and his whole behavior indicative of a madman. As he seizes the prepuce of a young boy, the audience of older men shout in chorus, "Behold the maddened one." Thus, Huck's terrifying experiences in Pap's log cabin parallel in a really remarkable way the series of initiatory tortures that is a central feature of the puberty rites. On the day after Pap's seizure, Huck determines to escape and stages an ingenious mock murder of himself, leaving a bloodied axe in the cabin as evidence of the crime. The whole community believes that he has been killed, and as James Cox points out, he remains dead throughout the entire journey down the river. Once the boy has undergone the circumcision ceremony, he is considered dead, and he remains dead for the duration of his novitiate. Webster observes that almost universally, initiation rites include a mimic representation of the death of the novice. Iliade, discussing the elaborate scenarios of initiatory death, which characterizes so many puberty rites, reports that in certain tribes, the women are shown the bloody lances with which the spirit is supposed to have killed the novices. At this point in many puberty ceremonies, the neophyte goes off to live for an extended period in the bush. Generally, he is placed under a number of dietary prohibitions. Certain foods are forbidden to him. He is accompanied by an older man, often a shaman, whose duty is to tutor him in tribal morality and show him the secrets and miracles of the medicine man. Describing the initiation ceremonies of the Yuin tribe of Australia, for example, A.W. Howitt writes that after the ordeals, the novices had to go and live by themselves in the bush on such food as they could catch, and which might be lawful for them to eat. They were under the charge of the cabos, who would instruct them. Webster discusses the instruction received by candidates during the initiatory seclusion at some length. Being cut off from all the interests of the outer world, the lads had an opportunity for meditation, which must have tended to mature their minds, especially as they were at the same time instructed in a good code of morals. Each lad is attended by one of the elders who instructs him in his duties and gives him advice to regulate his conduct through life. It should be noted that while the elders do indeed serve as spiritual fathers to the boys, there is something distinctly maternal about them. The male shaman or seer, writes Eric Neumann, is in high degree feminine and often appears in women's dress, and Henderson maintains that the master of initiation is both a mother and father to the novice. It is his function to bring the boy to a second birth, to continue and consummate his post-uterine gestation, the long process of his growth to a fully human maturity. Once Huck has died, he too goes off to live by himself, and in the thick woods of Jackson's Island meets Miss Watson's Jim. Enslaved in St. Petersburg, Jim is a caricature, a comical witch doctor performing mumble-jumble with a hairball. But as soon as he is free of the corruption of civilization, he becomes a genuine magus, a priest of the river god, seer and shaman, interpreter of the dark secrets of nature. Some young birds come along, flying a yard or two at a time in lightning. Jim said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and to be reckoned it was the same way when young birds done it. I was going to catch some of them, but Jim wouldn't let me. He said it was death. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you're going to cook for dinner, because that would bring bad luck. The same as if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sunup next morning, or else the bees would all weaken down and quit working and die. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. Jim's function, however, is not merely to instruct Huck in the lore of weather and the omens of luck and the talismans of death. Like the primitive, the dark tutor who helps unlock the sound heart imprisoned in Huck's breast, nurturing and protecting, standing watch over Huck's while the boy gets some extra sleep and yearning for his own children. He is both spiritual father and good mother. James M. Cox comments perceptively on Jim's ambivalent nature. It is to Jim that Huck retreats as if to a savior. He it is who mothers Huck as they travel down the big river, and he it is who, knowing secretly that Huck's pap is dead forever, takes Huck to his own bosom to nourish him through the ordeals of being lost. Acting as Huck's foster father, Jim brings to that role a warmth and gentleness which Huck had never known under the brutal masculinity of his real father. Near the end of the novel, after Jim has accompanied and protected Huck on the perilous journey, how appropriate that he should be led back to the Phelps plantation, following his temporary escape with Tom, arrayed in the dress which the boys had stolen from Aunt Sally. The incident points up Jim's role of motherly father to Huck. Just before the flight from Jackson's Island, Huck also dresses up like a girl, disguising himself in a calico gown and sunbonnet so that he can sneak ashore and find out what was going on. This incident, too, has an interesting analog in the puberty initiations, for the novice's ritual transformation into a woman is an important part of many of these ceremonies. Iliadi, Bettelheim, Lowley, and Henderson all discuss this ritual transvesticism. According to Henderson, the purpose of the practice is to mobilize a bisexual response as an act of integration in the formation of the new man. This is acted out in certain tribal societies in which both novice and tutor and or master of initiation play maternally supportive and sometimes actively homosexual roles. The homoerotic element in Huck and Jim's relationship was pointed out long ago, of course, by Leslie Fiedler. Another incident common to initiation rites takes place while the boy and Jim are still living on Jackson's Island. One night, while Huck and Jim are paddling over the flooded island in their canoe, a 2-story frame house comes floating by, the House of Death. Climbing in at an upstairs window, they see something laying on the floor in the far corner of the room. Jim walks over and finds that it is the naked body of a murdered man, his face too ghastly to look at. Huck doesn't want to see him and turns away. Iliadi records a number of puberty ceremonies involving death houses, and one of them, a Ephesian ritual, is strikingly similar to the episode in Twain's book. On a particular day, the novices, led by a priest, proceed to the Nanda, a stone enclosure. They are then taken inside. There lie a row of dead men, covered with blood, their bodies apparently cut open and their entrails protruding. The priest guide walks over the corpses, and the terrified novices follow him to the other end of the enclosure, where the chief priest awaits him. Suddenly he blurts out a great yell, whereupon the dead men start to their feet and run down to the river to cleanse themselves from the blood and filth which they are besmeared. The resurrection thus enacted is meant to represent the novice's own approaching rebirth. The dead man whom Huck and Jim discovered does not, of course, spring back to life. Nevertheless, like the Nanda, this house of death contains the promise of rebirth, for among all the trash scattered over the floor, the greasy cards and empty whiskey bottles and masks made out of black cloth, images of decay and dissolution, Huck finds a bottle that had milk in it and a rag stopper for a baby to suck, a symbol of new birth. In some puberty ceremonies, Iliadi explains, novices actually undergo a ritual return to earliest infancy, i.e., they are symbolically transformed into babies, forced to live naked for long periods of time, forbidden to speak or to use their hands to feed themselves. At one point in his journey, Huck also is assimilated into a baby, for in the so-called raft passage, as Kenneth S. Lynn has perceived, he identifies himself with the infant in the raftsman's tale. Crouched in the darkness, naked and afraid, Huck seems utterly apart from the coarse, rough men, but the fantasy of violence and terror which the raftsman has spun for the scoffing delight of his fellows nevertheless vitally involves the runaway boy, for the story tells, after all, of a man who locked up his son, and of a naked child floating down the river in search of its father. That Huck has escaped to his fabulous voyage by making his pap think he has been murdered only completes his identification with this dead baby who is somehow reborn in the river, an identification which he makes explicit when suddenly seized from his hiding place and surrounded by strange men demanding to know his name. Huck jokingly replies, "Charles William Albright, sir." Always in twain, the best jokes reveal the profoundest connections, and with the release of laughter triggered by Huck's superbly timed joke, the chapter not only reaches its humorous climax, but we are suddenly made aware that through Huck we have been eavesdropping on a parable of death by violence and rebirth by water, which takes us to the very heart of the novel. As Huck and Jim journeys down the river towards Cairo, the relationship established on Jackson's Island remains the same. Huck's situation continues to parallel that of the primitive neophyte during his period of isolation from society, and Jim's that of the attendant shaman responsible for the boy's moral education. Even their self-imposed restrictions on food stealing are the comic equivalent of the dietary taboos that are part of a novice's ritual seclusion. Mornings before daylight, I slipped in the cornfields and borrowed a watermelon or a mushmelon or a pumpkin, or some new corn or things of that kind. Pop always said it weren't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back sometime, but the widow said it wasn't anything but a soft name for stealing and no decent body to do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right and Papa was partly right, so the way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them anymore. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others, so we talked it over all one night, drifting along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons or the cantaloupes or the muskmelons or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory and concluded to drop crab apples and peasants. As Neil Schmitz points out, however, once the raft has drifted beyond Cairo, Jim becomes, in a very real sense, a supernumerary. Huck's education passes out of his hands into those of the Duke and Dauphin. These con men who fleeced folks at a revival meeting, sallied an entire town with their ridiculous tragedy, cheat orphans, and betrayed Jim, seem ill-suited for the roles of shaman and tutor. Nevertheless, they embody certain qualities that are characteristic of the primitive medicine man, and their manner of teaching, while diametrically opposed to Jim's, parallels an instructional method that is common to puberty rites. Discussing the phenomenon of shamanism in The Masks of God, Joseph Campbell quotes from the account of various missionaries who described the medicine men as humbugs, actors, creatures apart from the honest hunters, men who, accustomed to holding their own against many, had to have their tricks. Campbell then goes on to examine the shaman as an archetypal trickster figure, an incarnation of the chaos principle, the principle of disorder, the force careless of taboos and shattering bounds. According to Jung, the function of the trickster is to ritually enact and thereby hold before the eyes of the more highly developed individual different forms of bestial behavior, and to represent a rudimentary level of consciousness which should never be forgotten for long. This therapeutic anamnesis, writes Jung, is the most effective method in primitive cultures for keeping the inferior traits of character conscious and subjecting them to conscious criticism. Thus, during certain puberty rites, the medicine men, the masters of initiation, perform pantomimic representations that are intended to teach the novices in vivid fashion what things they must in future avoid. Various offenses against morality are exhibited, and the guardians warn the novices of their death or of violence should they attempt to repeat the actions they have just witnessed. Howitt describes some of these performances in detail. The pieces of buffoonery are perhaps some of the most remarkable features of the proceedings. If one were to imagine all sorts of childish mischief mixed up with the cardinal sins represented in burlesque and ironically recommended to the boys on their return to camp and afterwards, it would give a not inept representation of what takes place. But there is the remarkable feature that at the end of almost every sentence, indeed of every indecent, immoral, or lewd suggestion, the speaker adds "ya," which negates all that has been said and done. This gives to the whole proceedings a sort of carnival and April Fool aspect. One pantomime represents a number of very old men who came up, following each other out of the forest, and circled round the fire, swaying from side to side at each step, and each holding his head with both hands, one at each temple. After going round the fire several times, the chain broke up into individuals, who began tickling each other, finally falling down into a heap, screeching with laughter. Such an exhibition of childishness and venerable old grey beards was ridiculous. This was impressed on the novices by going up to them and saying, "When you go back to camp like that, yeah," by this warning them not to be guilty of such childish acts in the characters of men. Other pantomimic representations were to impress rules of tribal morality by visible instances. How it goes on to give examples of two more pantomimes, one dealing with adultery, the second with the offenses for which is said, "The cities of the plain were destroyed by celestial fire." In all these performances, how it points out, the men are naked, though they are usually decorated with circles, stripes, and corkscrew linings of white pipe clay. What I'm suggesting then is that the Duke and Dauphin function as shamanistic tricksters, acting out various offenses against morality, instructing Huck by negative example. Both of these humbugs are medicine men. The Duke dabbles a little in patent medicine and occasionally travels around dissipating witch spells, while the Dauphin admits to having done considerable in a doctoring way, laying on o' hands in my best holt for cancer and paralysis and such things. And I can to tell a fortune pretty good when I've got somebody along to find out the facts for me. Preaching's my line too. And their performance of the King's Camelopard is strikingly similar to the scene described by Howitt, the antics of the clay-painted altars. The next minute, the king came a-prancing out on all fours naked, and he was painted all over, rings streaked and striped, all sorts of colors, as splendid as a rainbow. But never mind the rest of his outfit, it was just wild, but it was awful funny. The people most killed themselves laughing, and when the king got done capering and capered off behind the scenes, they roared and clapped and stormed and hawed, till he came back and done it over again, and after that, they made him to do it over again. While it would make a cow laugh to see the shines that old idiot cut. The ritualistic nature of this scene has been recognized by Robert Tracy, who finds overtones of a ritualized sexual indecency in it. As we have seen, the pantomimes performed for the novice often do in fact include representations of heterosexual debauchery and sodomy. By exposing Huck to different forms of immorality and human weakness, then, the Duke and Dauphin helped to complete his education. In most primitive societies, on completing their passage to adulthood, the novices are given new names to symbolize their second birth. Among the Arunta, Radin points out, the boy who has successfully passed through the initiation ceremonies is reborn as the morally good one. In Huckleberry Finn, the rebirth imagery that signifies the culmination of Huck's initiation into manhood begins with the Phelps Farm episode in a chapter aptly entitled, "I Have a New Name." By this time, too, Huck has certainly earned the right to be known as a morally good one. And although this episode is followed by a sequence of events in which the author portrays Huck as failing to bring his passage into adulthood to a satisfactory conclusion, the young hero seems to have found true masculine maturity despite Twain's attempt to have him yet remain a child. For here at Phelps Farm, after all the ordeals he has braved, and after all the trials, mishaps, and victories through which he so clearly has learned what it means to grow up, we have it in Huck's own words. But if they was joyful, it weren't nothing to what I was, for it was like being born again.